Now, you would think the blockbuster started with Steven Spielberg and Jaws, which is true, but
Yes.
somehow Gerald Ford is part of this thing. Tell us about the blockbuster loop.
Yeah, I really loved working on this because it was the kind of thing that you find that like there's like this conventional wisdom that Jaws was such a big success that it completely changed the way that the movie industry releases films. That they then all became studio produced, studio directed, studio cast, big studio productions that were released on a big summer Friday and then made all their money back over the course of the summer. This idea of the blockbuster, and the idea that the blockbuster was born with Jaws was kind of, it makes sense because shortly after Jaws, that's when you start seeing the late 70s and the 1980s, which is really the dawn of that era in which movies were big. That's some of the story, but that is not the whole story, because the whole story is that, you have to ask, not only did you have a new form of filmmaking emerge and a new distribution pattern and emerge, but the old one died. And the old one was interesting because the old one was kind of based on tax evasion. Essentially, how it worked was that there was a kind of a loophole in the late 60s and early 70s tax code that allowed people to invest in, let's say, an oil well, and they would put $100,000 down, and they would then use that $100,000 to get a bunch more from the bank, maybe $400,000, and then they would invest that $500,000 into digging an oil well. And then on their taxes, they could write that the business lost $500,000 that year. This was advantageous then because at the time, the top marginal rate was over 80-90%. And so if you were a dentist who made a couple $1 million, that last dollar, you're paying 80 cents of that to the IRS. And so it made sense to invest in these kinds of wildcat ideas. And, it's not just oil wells that I'm talking about, it's also films. And so there was this kind of guy that was a film packager who would basically get all these dentists and rich guys and businessmen together who didn't want to pay taxes on it. And they were like, give me this money and then we'll invest it in films. Enough of the time, the film makes its budget back. So you'll have to do that. We'll do this again when you make your money back next time. Sometimes it loses it. Sometimes you accidentally invest in Dog Day Afternoon and you make a ton of money. And the IRS got wind of this, that all these guys were evading all this money, that Paramount's entire slate for a couple of years there was predominantly funded in this manner. And they were like, well, we can't have this anymore. And so in 1976, when Gerald Ford signed the tax reform, they eliminated this loophole, the idea that you could put only 100,000 in and then lose a lot more money on other stuff to make your tax loss look bigger than it actually was. And so, poor rich guys, they had to figure out new ways to evade taxes. But what the actually meant for the movie industry was that a huge source of funding all of a sudden just evaporated, and you were not able to kind of rely on this loophole that made things easier on the rich folks, but also kind of was an IRS subsidy to produce small films. And you mentioned Shampoo, like the Beatty flick, but like that's the first on-screen role of Carrie Fisher. Like a lot of these films were consequential. A lot of these films made a difference. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like these movies that were funded through this elaborate and arguably illegal at times strategy, or at least eventually illegal, were important to the development of the genre and really helped make it so that young directors got an opportunity because the money had to go somewhere.